Landmark decisions came down this week from the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. House Speaker Pelosi finally has a committee to look at the January 6th Capitol insurrection, and criminal charges came down on the former president's family business. Luckily, to help us better understand all of this, the analysis of Brooks and Capehart, that is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, columnist for the Washington Post. Hello to both of you. Very good to see you as we head into this July 4th weekend. A lot to talk about. Let's start with the Supreme Court decision on voting rights. David, it was a decision we've been waiting for, a very stark division between how the justices saw this in a lopsided 6-3 decision. How did you read what you saw from the justices?
Yeah, well, this is one of the few, relatively few, surprisingly few 6-3 ideological decisions, but this was straight down party lines. I guess I have three reactions. The first is it's always worth reminding this is an answer to a problem that doesn't exist. There is no voting fraud or no major voting fraud. All these state rules, we don't need them. They're just in service to the Trump lie that the election was stolen. Second, the intent. I have every reason to believe the intent of the legislatures in all these places was to help their party, basically a white Republican party, and therefore they're trying to make it harder for people in the other party to vote. I imagine that's their intent. The impact is the crucial thing here. What is their disparate impact? And I only look at this from looking at the research. I don't look at it legally, but the research suggests the impact of all these kinds of voting changes is pretty minimal. Over the last 15 years, certainly not in the days of Jim Crow, it was not minimal back then. But in the last 15 years, when states have tried to make it easier to vote or make it a little less easy to vote, the impact on actual voting has not been that great. So it doesn't strike me as catastrophic. But the final thing to be said is, even though the impact is incremental, it's disparate. African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, they are more likely to be hurt. Even though the effects aren't big, they're not equally shared across all groups. So on the whole, I think the court made a mistake, but it's probably not a catastrophic one.
How do you see it, Jonathan?
Well, I don't know if I agree with David in terms of it not being catastrophic, simply because, to another point that David said, that this is a solution in search of a problem. As someone said to me once, after I said that, pretty much the same thing on the show a few months ago, they said that's the wrong frame, because actually, from the Republican perspective, the problem is too many people are voting for Democrats. And in particular, too many people of color, i.e. black people, are voting. And that is the problem from the Republican perspective. And these laws are out there, while it might not be catastrophic in terms of the way you view it right now, David, but it's really interesting that after African American voters, people of color, the Democratic coalition came out en masse to vote for Joe Biden, to vote for Senators Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia, that all of a sudden there's a voter problem, a voting issue that needs to be solved. And that problem is that too many of those people are voting. And the idea that the Supreme Court would say, well, you know, it's not such a big deal, is really, it's just really a travesty and doesn't do anything for Chief Justice John Roberts' goal of trying to keep the Supreme Court looking like a neutral player. But when it comes to voting rights, Chief Justice Roberts isn't a neutral player in this.
Well, speaking of what happened in the Georgia vote, I happen to have a rare and very fortunately had an interview earlier this week with former President Jimmy Carter. Was in Plains on the occasion of he and his wife Rosalind about to celebrate their 75th wedding anniversary. And I just want to run a little excerpt of that interview, because I did ask him, David, about, we didn't know at that point what the court would do, but about what's happened in Georgia, these tightening laws. Here's part of what he said.
All over the world, we've always, ever since the Carter Center was founded, tried to promote maximum involvement among the people in the election itself, and make sure that votes were counted accurately. And all of the things have gone by the board because of a Republican state legislature who take the position that Trump has espoused.
And he's saying, in other words, the changes, his own Carter Center, which has monitored elections around the world, was called on to monitor elections in Georgia. So you now have a situation where what the United States used to worry about in the rest of the world is happening here, David.
Yeah, earlier this year I read Ron Chernow's magnificent biography of Ulysses S. Grant, and as part of that biography, he covers the story of Reconstruction. He covers the story of when former slaves were given the vote and taken away. And so it's hard not to read that history and hear some echoes today. So morally, I completely agree. If given the history of America, and if you're a legislator of any party, you do not want to be on the side of disparate outcomes along racial grounds. I mean, it's just abhorrent. I guess I would disagree with President Carter in that I do think the 2022 election is going to be a fair election. I don't think it's totally, we've totally trashed our system. And that's why I make the emphasis just that when you try to discriminate against people, one of the things that's happened, and this is not making it right, they come back at you harder. And so you get turnout increases when people perceive the legislatures are trying to turn us away. Whether that will still be the system long term is an open question. But I think overall, we have mail-in ballots, we have longer voting periods than we did 20, 30 years ago. I still think, as much as one can be outraged by what's happening, our election system will be fair in 2022, I imagine.
And Jonathan, I was struck that in the poll that we did that came out this week with NPR and Marist, 79% of the respondents said they think it's good to require people to show a government ID before they can vote.
Sure, and Stacey Abrams, when the Joe Manchin compromise when the For the People Act came out, one of the things in there was voter ID. Stacey Abrams came out and said that she was fine with it, but that was just a one-sentence answer. The fine print of her answer is everyone's fine with voter ID. The problem comes in when some states demand only photo ID and not other forms of identification. And then when they demand photo ID, they then put restrictions on the kinds of photo IDs that can be presented. And so you have in some states where a student can't show their student photo ID, but someone can just show up and show their gun permit and be able to vote. And that is the issue. That is the problem. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask people to prove who they are. The problem comes in when you start picking and choosing which pieces of identification allow you to exercise your right to vote.
So much to ask the two of you about this week. David, I do want to raise the indictment that New York prosecutors handed down against the Trump business and his chief financial officer. My question to both of you is, how does this affect former President Trump's political fortunes?
Yeah, I guess for me, it remains to be seen still. I confess, if you had asked me how much corruption there was in the Trump organization, I would have expected way worse than some undisclosed fringe benefits. And so if that's all it is, then I would be underwhelmed. But that's probably not all it is. As every legal expert seems to be saying these days, they seem to have gone after this guy, Alan Weisselberg, as an attempt to turn him. He's been involved in Trump organization numbers for decades. And if they can hit him really hard, which they really hit him hard on these untaxed benefits, and if he's facing jail time, he would be certainly the person who would know all the secrets going all the way up to the top of the Trump organization. So if this is the beginning of a turning of a set of witnesses, then it really is very perilous for Trump. If this is all there is, I would be surprised, and Trump would be relatively safe from this kind of indictment.
Jonathan, how perilous for former President Trump?
In terms of his political standing, I don't think perilous at all. Probably one of the truer statements ever to come out of Donald Trump's mouth came during the 2016 campaign when he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any support. He has shown time and time and time again that is true. For his diehard supporters, this is just one more piece of the quote-unquote and not true witch hunt against him. So I don't see this hurting him in any way with his true believers.
And the last thing I want to ask two of you about is something the president, former president, has denounced, David, and that is House Speaker Pelosi naming a select committee to investigate what happened, the insurrection at the Capitol. On January the 6th, as you know, she tried very hard. Democrats tried very hard to get a commission created. Republicans blocked that in the Congress, in the Senate. But now there is a select committee. She's named several members, including Republican Liz Cheney, who's been critical of the former president. How much can we expect to learn from an organization, I mean, from an entity like this?
Well, we're not going to get the dispassionate, impartial viewpoint that I think a lot of us hoped for, but we're going to get a political process, and we'll probably get a majority Democratic report and a minority Republican report. I think a couple things are interesting to me. One is Liz Cheney is a really tough person. To go against her own leader and to accept this appointment from Nancy Pelosi, that shows she's just very tough. And she has decided that it's her oath to defend the Constitution, to look into what happened on January 6th, and more power to her. As to what the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, does, I'm intrigued. Does he go, I assume he'll staff his side of the committee, because otherwise the Republicans will be silenced. Does he go and get super hard-charging, fire-breathing right-wingers who will make Fox happy and sort of disrupt the whole works, what Elise Stefanik has become? Or does he go with people who actually voted to certify the Biden election? I imagine he'll go with the hard chargers, and we'll get something of a political theater. But I do think, even despite the theatrical elements that seem to be destined to, I do think we'll learn stuff, just from witnesses, just from the back and forth of politics.
What are your expectations, Jonathan, from this? Do you think we will learn very much? How do you see it playing out?
Well, I do think we will learn a lot. But the key thing that everyone should keep in mind is that for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is a deeply faithful person, devout Catholic, her love of the Constitution ranks up there as number 2 in terms of what she strongly believes in. And for her, as a member of Congress representing a district in California, as a constitutional officer, as Speaker of the House, for her allegiance and oath to the Constitution is inviolable. And the fact that people stormed the Capitol on a really sacred day and sacred process for American democracy, certifying the election, it was an affront to her as an American and an affront to her as the Speaker of the House. She wants this committee because she wants to know what happened, why it happened, so that we can all learn how to prevent it from happening again. And so anyone who thinks that this is only a partisan exercise doesn't really understand who she is and why she is doing it, and more importantly, why she turned to Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney to be on that committee, because also someone from the opposite ideological spectrum from the Speaker, but who also has made it clear since January 6th that her oath is not to a person, but to the Constitution.
And one way or another, we're going to continue to hear about January the 6th. Even as we approach this national holiday, July 4th. We thank you both. We hope you have a good and safe holiday. Jonathan Capehart, David Brooks, thank you both.
Thanks, Judy.
Same to you, Judy.